I'll ask you to turn in your Bibles. It will be tonight in 2 Kings chapter 14 at the end of it. Now, as we've been trying to change things up here a little bit on Wednesday nights, usually someone will get a month to be able to hopefully start and complete something. But again, you've known that I've been at this for a while, and we're still a long ways from my finishing. So at the end of December, we're still going to be waiting for me to finish this. I will say, though, that we have been making some good progress. I was just thinking back and looking at some of the archives. It's been since 2019 that I've been doing these studies with the Kings, and we've come this far. I mean, say what you will, I guess, whether that's a good or bad thing, whether I should be going faster or not. But we are just a little bit past the halfway point as far as the number of kings. I'd say in the overall scope of things, I'm probably about 2/3 of the way done. There's some of them where you can kind of group them together and just get a few out of the way, because there's some that there's only a couple verses that talk about them. Oddly enough, tonight, the king that we're talking about, there's only 7 verses that talk about this person, but yet he's probably one of the most important figures of the northern kingdom, aside from maybe people like Ahab, or the original Jeroboam. Tonight we're talking about Jeroboam the second. And so I have titled it tonight, this study that we're doing, and you may think it's only 7 verses, and I see a part 1 there. How are you going to divide 7 verses into 2 parts? Well, maybe you know me that I like to say a little bit more than I should sometimes and drag things out. But really, there's a lot more to say than what we see in these 7 verses. And to really cover the scope of what happens during the reign of this particular Jeroboam, we also have to look at, and I'll introduce you tonight to the prophet Hosea and the prophet Amos. And in fact, tonight is really, and next week, as I have opportunity, is going to be more or less a survey of those 2 prophets. So we're going to get a lot from there, talking about some of the specific things that were happening, which we don't see in these 7 verses. So you're probably already there. Let me make sure I'm there. 2 Kings chapter 14. And let's read these 7 verses together, and then I'll get into discussing the meaning behind them. 2 Kings 14, starting in verse 23. In the 15th year of Amaziah the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and reigned 41 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. He restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath unto the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he spake by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai the prophet, which was of Gath-hepher. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter. For there was not any shut up, nor any left, nor any helper for Israel. And the Lord said not that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, and all that he did, and his might, how he warred, and how he recovered Damascus and Hamath, which belonged to Judah, for Israel, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jeroboam slept with his fathers, even with the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son reigned in his stead. Hold your finger there, and as I mentioned about the prophets, let's turn to the prophet Hosea, and we'll read chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll get a little bit of an introduction to the prophet Hosea. One of the first ones, if you're looking past Daniel, Hosea chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. And then let's turn to Amos, and let's be introduced to Amos just a couple books over. Let's read chapter 1, verse 1 as we're introduced to Amos. Chapter 1, verse 1 of Amos says, The words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So I don't know how well it's going to work for you to hold your fingers in different places, because we're going to be jumping back a lot between all of these different places. It'll end up maybe being kind of a bit of a mock sword drill, but at any rate, hopefully you'll get more familiar with Hosea and Amos as we go back and forth there. Back to 2 Kings chapter 14 for the moment. I've titled this message tonight, Like Jeroboam, Like Jeroboam. And the explanation behind that, maybe you've heard the phrase, like father, like son. That's where I got the inspiration for phrasing it that way. And in a sense, you could call Jeroboam the first his father in kind of the grand scope of tracing the lineage back of the nation of Israel. You have the original Jeroboam, and from that you have all the kings. I think it was 11 of them up until this point here, that now we have Jeroboam the second. So I guess in that sense, it's kind of like father, like son. And we see that even with one of the verses that we read here, which explicitly declares that. Now, I've subtitled this, The Beginning of the End of the Northern Kingdom, and that hints a little bit at what I believe is some of the importance behind what happens and what is said of the reign of Jeroboam here. It is interesting in a lot of ways. The Jeroboam the first, that was the beginning of the northern kingdom. And Jeroboam here, the second, I believe, is the beginning of the end. So the first point I want to talk about tonight, first section, thing that we'll study, and we'll probably only get 2 out of the 3 things is how I've structured being able to do this tonight. Let's look at the sins of Jeroboam. That's a phrase that you saw in this passage. You've probably seen it in other passages as we've looked at some of the lives of the kings. And so let's explore that. Let's read again verse number 24. It says, "And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin." And that Jeroboam the son of Nebat is the one who is called that Jeroboam the first. Looking at the time of his reign, if you go back to verse 23, we just got done last week studying Amaziah, and this is about halfway through that time. Amaziah reigned for 29 years, so 15 years. He officially takes the throne about halfway through that time, so they are contemporary with each other. So a lot of years together, about 14 years or so, where both of them are reigning at the same time. Some interesting facts about this particular Jeroboam. You notice there in that verse also that he reigned 41 years. Out of all of the kings of the northern kingdom, this is the most years out of any of those kings. So it is, again, it's that much more perplexing why of someone who only has 7 verses that speaks of him, that, he had this big long reign, and yet this is all that's said of him in this particular place. Another interesting thing to note is that out of all of the kings combined between Israel and Judah, he's tied for the 3rd longest reign out of all the kings. There's Manasseh, who we haven't got to yet, 55 years. There's Uzziah, who we will be getting to pretty soon, 52 years. And then him and also King Asa of Judah reigned for 41 years. So 3rd longest overall out of all the kings. This is at the end of his reign, once you get to the point that, like in verse 29, he slept with his fathers, that time of his life comes to an end. Those 41 years are gone. It's just several decades after that, which the northern kingdom is taken into captivity by Assyria. I'll be covering that a little bit more next week as I talk about that and looking at the consequences of some of the things that happened during his reign. But we're looking at this idea, this thought, this phrase, the sins of Jeroboam, something that we've seen so many times. Another interesting thing to note, looking at verse 24, if you look at all 7 of those verses, that's the only verse that really speaks anything negative about what happened. And the rest of what you see would seem to be positive. He had successes. God worked on behalf of the kingdom, maybe not so much for his sake specifically, and we'll get to some of that in a little bit here. But how could his life be characterized in such a way when all of the rest of what you see is so positive? And that's where we have to go to the prophets. And they have a lot to say about what happened during his reign. This phrase, the sins of Jeroboam, or other ways you could search for it, the way of Jeroboam, or things related to the house of Jeroboam in relation to those sins, there's 21 different times where that idea is mentioned in the times of the kings here, and this is one of them right here. I've divided this up into a couple of different sections because in looking at the sins of Jeroboam, I want to look at a little bit of the history because I think this is an important focal point, and I think it's a significant enough reign of a king that I want to go back and just remind ourselves about what are these sins of Jeroboam that we're talking about. We're talking about Jeroboam the first in this case. So I don't know that you'll need to hold your place there, but if you want to go back to 1 Kings chapter 12, this is where we see some of this originally set up with Jeroboam the first. So the first section of what we're looking at with the sins of Jeroboam is the historical context of it. Even a couple chapters back from before 1 Kings 12, we're first introduced to him during the reign of Solomon. And when Solomon was struggling with some of his idolatry, God raised up adversaries for him, and one of those adversaries was Jeroboam the first. And so after Solomon's son Rehoboam took the throne and was meant to be the leader of the entire kingdom, but because he took the advice of the younger counselors as opposed to the older ones who had been with Solomon, the kingdom ended up splitting. And long story short, Jeroboam was the one that ended up taking over the remaining 10 tribes that split. So let's look at 1 Kings chapter 12, and let's read these verses about what he does here once he becomes the king. 1 Kings 12, starting in verse 26. And Jeroboam said in his heart, "Now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam king of Judah, and they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah." Whereupon the king took counsel, and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." And he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. And this thing became a sin. For the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. And he made an house of high places, and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah. And he offered upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. Some important things to note about that. Looking at what it says about the idol worship, some things that he did is he changed the place of worship. Hey, it's too much for you guys to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to pull you guys in, and we're going to have our own places of worship. Now, Jewish men were commanded to go to Jerusalem for the feast several times a year, and that was the pattern. But now he's saying, all right, now that I've got you guys under my control, and since I don't want you guys to go back and defect to David, we're going to make a couple of our own places, and I'm going to make it convenient for you. So Bethel would be in the lower part of the northern kingdom, kind of close to the border with Benjamin, and then Dan is kind of up in the north extreme part of the kingdom. In fact, some of the places that we read about in 2 Kings 14 that he recovered are kind of up in that region around where Dan is. So these are the 2 places that he set up for them to go worship. So he changed the place. He changed the object of their worship. He said, you know what? Let me just make these calves for you. It kind of reminds me of Exodus 32 when Aaron threw the gold in the fire and, oh, look, out came this calf. And I wonder if maybe he was inspired by that. I kind of think that about maybe thinking back to their history, that he wanted to make something like unto something like that. So, but he had two of them because he was going to put one in Bethel and one in Dan. And they're going to go to these places to use these objects of worship. And it mentions there that they're making sacrifices to them. They're burning incense to them. So note another phrase there, and this is something else that you see associated. Whenever you see this phrase talking about the sins of Jeroboam, or the way of Jeroboam, and I would point to verse number 30, where we're at right now, and this thing became a sin. And that's a phrase that you often see connected with whenever you see the sins of Jeroboam, that they made Israel to sin. This was something, it wasn't just the leadership that said, we're going to worship this. It was for the people as well. And I think he said as much there because he wanted the people to follow his system of worship, that they were going to go to those places, worship his objects. And so then they followed his pattern, his example. And that says a lot about who we have in leadership. A lot of times, and maybe I speak for general populace in a sense, that we just kind of follow the dictates of the country that we live in sometimes. I'm not speaking of us necessarily specifically, but just in general as a people, maybe in other countries this is the same way, where you just kind of blindly follow your leaders. And so they followed after their pattern. So if you have a good example, then you end up hopefully with a good results with the people that you have. But if you have a bad example, like you have with Jeroboam, you end up with people who end up following that example. And as it says there, he made Israel to sin. So there's also this feast in verse 32 that he talks about. If you're curious about that, that was meant to be patterned after the Day of Atonement, which happens exactly 1 month earlier. So he says, you know what, you see the kind of slyness behind this. I'm going to make something that's just, it's almost like real worship, but it's unique enough that he can claim it as his own. So in the 8th month of the 15th day, instead of the 7th month and the 15th day, that they're celebrating this. So let's look at some verses in the next chapter. So 1 Kings chapter 13. We see the beginning of the persistence of the sins of Jeroboam. Chapter 13, verse 33. After this thing, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way, but made again of the lowest of the people priests of the high places. Whosoever he would, he consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And this thing became sin unto the house of Jeroboam, even to cut it off and to destroy it from off the face of the earth. Even back then, God was ready to just cut them off for that. But God is long-suffering. God is patient. We've made it all the way now to Jeroboam II. We still see that phrase connected with the kings, the sins of Jeroboam. And so this has persisted. Just some other things to note that I see from this verse. Another thought I have is the standard that he has for those people who are leading this worship. He's just getting anybody. They may not necessarily be the most qualified to do it or the most spiritual people, but they're going to be his priest. That's another area as it pertains to leadership that we ought to be careful of. Who is being put into that position of leadership? Is that person the rightly qualified person? Now, in the previous chapter, it talks about he specifically wasn't pulling from the sons of Levi, and that's who it was supposed to be. But he's just saying, anyone can do this. So that's a danger that I think we need to be careful of in our churches even today. But this is something that was an appointment for their future destruction. A little bit of foreshadowing. We're going to be talking about some of that as we go through the study. So that was the historical context looking at the sins of Jeroboam. Let's look at some things relating to Jeroboam II now. And this is where we'll look at some of the prophets. So we'll go to Hosea, and you can hold your finger in Hosea, and then we'll also go to Amos, and then we'll go back and forth between those two. So these sins in this time period, the sins of Jeroboam II, one commentator divided them up into a couple of different categories. The one of those categories, and I borrowed his naming, by the way, related to what he calls religious decay. That would be the idolatry that was taking place. The other category that he mentioned was social corruption, and that's another thing that we'll see as we go through some of these verses. There's a lot of examples that we could talk about, and because I don't want to be up here and just read all of Hosea and all of Amos to you, because I'd say about 90% of what's there pertains to things related to the northern kingdom here. I'll spare you the time. You can go back and look at that yourselves. But we're going to look at some excerpts. So I call it kind of a survey, as I mentioned before. So first in this category of idolatry, if you look at Hosea chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, Hosea 4:15, it says, "Though thou, Israel, play the harlot, yet let not Judah offend, and come not ye unto Gilgal, neither go ye up to Bethaven, nor swear the Lord liveth. For Israel slideth back as a backsliding heifer. Now the Lord will feed them as a lamb in a large place." Verse 17, it's not on my slides here, but it's one I've read before in connection with idolatry here, and even more pertinent here. And Ephraim, you'll see, is pointed out a lot in some of these verses. So this, one thing that I would point out from these verses, so note the places. So there's also Gilgal mentioned here. Gilgal is another place which is mentioned in relation to this idol worship. When you see Bethaven there, that's kind of a loose reference to the region around Bethel. We know Bethel is one of the places where Jeroboam I set up one of those calves that he had made back all the way then. So he's talking about those places of worship that they had for their idol worship. The one thing I would pull from that, you notice that Judah is mentioned in this verse here. This is in a way kind of a warning. Hey, Judah, are you paying attention to what's going on with your sister over there? I don't want you to fall into that same trap. Now, at this point in time, you have, as I mentioned, Amaziah and those that succeed Amaziah. Now, they eventually get to a point where they're going to fall into some of this, but you have to get past Hezekiah really to get into some of the really bad stuff. But for now, Judah is doing okay. But Judah, pay attention, because I don't want you to be drawn into this worship that they're taking part of. So there, Hosea 4, let's turn to Hosea 6, verse number 10. I could have mentioned this also about the previous verse, but was just as pertinent here. Chapter 6, verse 10, "I have seen a horrible thing in the house of Israel. There is the whoredom of Ephraim. Israel is defiled." You see how it's characterized there. I would almost put that in the same level as if you've ever heard someone talk about defining the word abomination. I'm kind of visually illustrating it there, but it's highly repulsive. I've seen a horrible thing in the house of Israel. Now, to be fair, I didn't look at the actual word to know, but in my mind, when I think of a horrible, it's hard. I guess it's horrible enough being sick. No one wants being sick, but I've seen a horrible thing. And hopefully that's not something that can be said of us individually, that when God looks at our lives, that he sees a horrible thing. So these couple of sets of verses here, he's talked about being a harlot, he's talked about whoredom. This is spiritual adultery. So idolatry is kind of the general term that we use in talking about it. But this is spiritual adultery. It's them not being faithful to the God who has bought them. And there's places in these books where he talks about, I rescued you out of Egypt, and you're doing this to me. So there's a little bit that harkens back to that. So as we get further on in this, we'll also see some of God's heart as it relates to what he really wants for them. He doesn't want them to stay in their sin, but he also can't look past it. Let's look at another verse here. Chapter 8, verse 11 in Hosea. "Because Ephraim hath made many altars to sin, altars shall be unto him to sin. made many altars to sin. Now, I think about, of course, the specific ones mentioned, Bethel, Dan, Gilgal, we might throw in that as well. But other places, many places that they've set up to commit this idol worship. What I see from those phrases there is just the multiplication of what this idolatry had ended up becoming. Sin just kept growing and growing and growing. That phrase at the end of that verse there, altar shall be unto him to sin, or that is for the purpose of sinning. There's more and more altars, and so there's more and more opportunity for sin that happens because of that. So from Hosea there, let's look at Amos a little bit. There's one set of verses we'll look at here relating to the idolatry. And that's in Amos chapter 4. Amos chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. And he says there, come to Bethel and transgress. At Gilgal, multiply your transgression and bring your sacrifices every morning and your tithes after 3 years, and offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving with leaven, and proclaim and publish the free offerings. For this liketh you, O ye children of Israel, saith the Lord. This gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what their worship looked like. And they're advertising this. Hey, come to these places. Let's do this. Let's perpetuate this. Let's grow this. Let's multiply this. And they had these different places, and they would have these rituals that they would do. We've already talked about, in general, some of the sacrifices and the incense burning that would take place with this. Another thing, having just come out of Thanksgiving, this kind of stuck out to me. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving with leaven. And now, what do you know about, say, for example, the Feast of Passover and leaven? What were they not allowed to have as part of that feast? Leaven. And yet, they're doing this with leaven in the things that they offer. I think there's also maybe a spiritual connotation to that too. And in my Sunday school class, when I was teaching about a month or so ago, we talked about leaven in a spiritual sense as well, that their worship was being contaminated. And so that's what's happening here. They're sacrifices of thanksgiving, but they're contaminated, and they're not being done in the way that they should be. And he says in verse 5, for this liketh you. Hey, this is just like you guys now to be doing these things. When I think of you guys, I think of this. This is so like you, Israel. And unfortunately, that could be said of them at this point. So the other category of things, social corruption. Let's look at some things here. Back in Hosea chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4 and verse number 1. It says there, hear the word of the Lord, ye children of Israel. For the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break out, and blood toucheth blood. Just kind of a whole litany of things that was happening. And I believe this could be placed during the reign of Jeroboam. And, chapter 1, verse 1 says as much, that if you're looking at the northern kingdom, we're talking about this being during the time of his reign. Notice some of those things. No truth. Are we in a time today where there are churches that don't have the truth? They're not teaching the truth. Or maybe in a culture that doesn't like to hear the truth. They don't like people like us telling them the truth. No knowledge of God. Hey, let's take that stuff out of schools. Let's get that out of our sight so that we don't have to look at it or think about it. No knowledge, no truth, nor knowledge of God in the land. It's just a few verses down where there's maybe one of the more famous verses from this chapter, that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And that's true. I mean, is ignorance not something that is a hindrance to us as Christians? The ignorance of the truth. And so then we're likely to fall into any kind of false kinds of things. There's a number of things, but time fails me to mention them. But we have a lot more to go through, so I'll go on to my next verses here. We'll see some similar kinds of things in Hosea 11, verse number 12. Hosea 11, verse 12. It says there, Ephraim compasseth me about with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah yet ruleth with God and is faithful with the saints. There is very much a contrast between the northern and the southern kingdom at this time. While the northern kingdom was, as it said here, they're full of lies, deceit, that Judah here, they're wanting to do things God's way. They're wanting to be faithful. So complete opposites there. And another place where I might insert, hey, be careful, Judah. And unfortunately, knowing history, I know that they eventually fall into some of those things. But at least at this time, this was true of them, that Judah was on the right side. In Amos chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. So before this part of Amos, he's picking on some other places like Judah. So Judah's mentioned. Moab is mentioned. Ammon is mentioned. Gaza is mentioned. Edom is mentioned. And the same phrase is used in discussing them. So after that, I don't see any kind of an introduction like that. And so my thought is that after that, he's talking about Israel, the northern kingdom specifically there. Let's look at Amos 2, verse number 6. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they sold the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of shoes, that pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor, and turn aside the way of the meek. And a man and his father will go in unto the same maid to profane my holy name. And they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar, and they drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. What I see here is oppression taking place. The poor, it was not a good place to be a poor person, nor was it a good time to be someone who tries to do right. Because they were going to come after you, and you could be sold into slavery, as is suggested here. And not only that, there's this other just really wicked things in verse number 7. I won't give a description of that, but it's bad. I'll say that. And then verse 8, if all of that weren't bad enough that they were just doing these things, they were celebrating the fact that they were doing these things. They were breaking out the wine to celebrate that they were doing these things to the poor people and to the righteous people and oppressing them. Amos chapter 5, verse 12. The Lord says through the prophet there, for I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins. They afflict the just. They take a bribe, and they turn aside the poor in the gate from their right. Really just a continuation of what we read from the previous verses and reiterating he says, I know. They may not think that God knows. They may not acknowledge the true God. But guess what? Whether they know it or not, God is keeping score, and God knows what's taking place there. So this is really just kind of a handful of some of the things that I could bring up from these books. Again, if you want to look into some more of the detail of what it says there, I encourage you to read Hosea and Amos for yourself. I don't know that I'm going to have time to get into my next section tonight. I wanted to end on a good note, because I wanted to talk about not just the sins of Jeroboam, but the mercies of God, which is something that I see in these later verses. I'll kind of whet your appetite. We'll go back to those verses, and then we'll finish there for now. 2 Kings chapter 14. Because while they were in this state of wickedness, there was at least some glimmer of God working through this. Verse 25, chapter 14. He restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath unto the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he spake by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai the prophet, which was of Gath-hepher. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter, for there was not any shut up, nor any left, nor any helper for Israel. And the Lord said not that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam and all that he did, and his might, how he warred, how he recovered Damascus and Hamath, which belonged to Judah for Israel, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Just some things to mention here. Despite this evil reign, as I've already said, they saw some of this success that took place. And this success was even prophesied by Jonah, and this is the only other mention of Jonah outside of the book of Jonah in the Old Testament here. So this was a prophecy that Jonah, and yes, it's that Jonah, that he mentioned that this was going to take place, that they were going to have this success in being able to recover that territory. And that territory was what they had originally had around the time of Solomon. So restoring those borders. When it says coast there, it's talking about borders. Why did he have this success? And that's probably what I want to get into more next time. But I'll leave you with that for now. There is hope and there is life beyond this. But it is a serious thing to think about the things that took place here, but also how we face maybe some very similar things in some ways. They're not manifested the same way, where we carve out little idols and we set them up on a platform and worship them. Maybe there are places in the world where they really do still do that, but it's the same problem. It just looks a little bit different today. So maybe a little homework for you. If you wanted to look at Amos and Hosea, again, I'd encourage you to do that. But I guess the thing that catches me the most with this, that I was thinking about, that while so little is said, you might think that things were going well, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, that there's a lot more under the cover that was not so much known, and that's part of what I'm trying to help you dig out here. We might have things might look good for us on the outside, and you look at these 7 verses and you say, how is Jeroboam's reign so bad? And that's where we have to be diligent as a student of the Word of God to dig those things out. But then also, as we think about that thought and apply it, what does God know about us beneath the surface? And I have to ask myself that question. And that's a thought that is meant to help keep me pure, and for you as well, that God wants us to be pure. So it's good to be reminded of these things so that we can avoid their mistakes.